Do you just want me to take a few minutes looking at them, or do you want Phil Brown to sort of talk me through what
I was going to ask for the second,
Yeah.
which means that your request for people to take their seats is completely counterbanded. Sorry about that. I've discussed it with my learned friend very, very briefly.
Yeah.
I think the idea was that for those that want to or need to come around the model so they can see what it is that Mr. Phil Brown's talking to. I don't think it's going to take very long.
No, I think it's an excellent idea. I'm very happy.
I'll share that.
Okay.
Might we start with these two here? I do just gather round. I was discussing in my evidence the great galleons of Oxford Street. And
Just pause a second.
Sure. Sorry. Yeah. Anna, can you see it? So I was discussing my evidence.
One moment.
Oh yeah. Apologies. Sorry.
Okay. Far away.
I was discussing in my evidence the great galleons of Oxford Street, and this model at 1 to 2000 and this at 1 to 1000 perhaps serves to illustrate the point. This is the proposals, and this is the existing condition. So again, we'll recognise that we talked about Orchard House, 23 Orchard Street, 10 Portland Mews, and Neil House on there. And this is the existing Debenhams, now currently under construction.
Right.
This is the existing House of Rays, and we can do a quick swap in just to see the scale of proposals. So that is our proposals. This is the under construction HMM scheme for Debenhams, and this the under construction scheme for House of Fraser. Grand plus 9, Grand plus 9, Grand plus 9, Grand plus 9. So you can go taller, Grand plus 18 on that side. Grand plus 8, this is the OSD at Hanover Square. This is Lifshitz Davison. This is the OSD I was designing when I was a partner at PLP. Grand plus 6, Grand plus 8. The Hanover Square one, sort of interesting. You get a vertical facade on the back and more articulated facade to the square. We can talk about it in a moment, but you get an articulated facade to the main streets and a vertical facade to the rear as an example. I didn't quite know why we made the two models. In a way, they sort of show the same thing at different scales. This might be for the less, well-sighted. But we can swap in the existing and the proposal on either scale.
Because could you explain where the conservation area boundaries are in relation to this and then this?
Oh, yes. Okay. So Mayfair conservation area boundary to the south of our site, sorry, excluding Park House, apologies for that.
Yeah.
Stratford Place conservation area, front half of Selfridges, but not the northern house, and then the Portman Estate conservation area, which as we were talking about, technically includes half the bridge. I think we have it on that side. Yeah. We should have coloured the conservation areas, Russell. I don't think we can get much more out of.
I think that's fine. I've got the maps.
But then we'll go on. Do be careful. There's trip hazards galore. We'll go off the scale to 1 to 150.
Okay.
This is the proposals only in the immediate context and only showing the proposal that exists to you discussing.
Mr. Fraser, it's 12 now. I haven't had estimates yet, but how long do you think you'll be in cross-examination?
So I think you gave the suggested maximum of an hour and a half. I'm going to try and keep within an hour and a half.
Okay.
So, I mean, how that squares with lunch, I'm entirely in your hands. I can find a convenient moment around 1 o'clock.
Probably that would be better. I mean, if you think you'll finish by 1:15, then we'll carry on, but if not, then fine.
We'll see where we are at 1.
That's about 9 o'clock. Do you have a list of documents you want to take me to, or?
I do, sir, yes. So it's going to be Mr. Pilbro's proof of evidence.
Yeah.
And rebuttal. CD 1.7A, which is part 1 of the DAS. CD 1.7B, which is part 2 of the DAS. CD 1.32, the structural methodology statement. CD 4.13, which is GLA stage 2. Mel Allwood's appendix 2. And then Mr. Sturgis's rebuttal.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Good afternoon, Mr. Pilbro. I wish I could refer to you by your first name and for you to refer to mine by mine, but I'm afraid I'm going to observe the formalities of the process.
Understood.
For the time being.
But it's 19, yes, that's where we get to.
Yeah.
So, Mr. Pilbro, obviously we need to think about proportionate use of inquiry time. And I know, of course, that you're not the only witness who's being called by M&S. And so how I've decided to divide up the different parts of my cross-examination is to focus with you on the consideration of refurbishment alternatives. And then issues relating to the new building and the design-related issues to do with heritage impacts. I'm afraid I'm going to leave for Dr. Mealy rather than yourself.
Understood.
And that's not, of course, because I agree with everything that you've said, but rather it's just about making sure that the right witness is being asked the right question.
Yeah.
So what I propose to do is to divide my cross-examination into 2 parts. The first is to look at what was considered at the time, the feasibility studies early on when you were first instructed, and why refurbishment was rejected. And then secondly, to look at your section 4 of your proof, where you consider refurbishment like on a more current basis. So just to make a point in relation to that second part now, your presentation included, I've lost count of the number, but I think it's something in the region of 20 to 30 slides towards the end, which we've not seen before. And say don't object to that evidence going in, but inevitably we are asking you, if possible, to send a copy of those slides because they've not been seen by us before, because we're going to need to take them away for Mr. Sturgis to consider them. So
I should have raised that. I take it as read that there'll be inquiry documents.
They will, sir, and we've got hard copies now, if the learned friend wishes them. And I accept entirely at this point. I would just say that almost all of the slides towards the end of the presentation are based upon Mr. Sturgis's own evidence. So where you see an image, it's from the rebuttal proof. But I accept entirely what you say, and we can either provide them now or at lunchtime.
And Mr. Fraser, if it arises after Mr. Sturgis has looked at that new evidence that he thinks that there is something that's new and not just put in a new form, then I'm happy to recall it. If that helps.
I'm grateful, sir. I mean, I don't think that's going to be
I
necessary.
didn't think so when I was looking through it, but
Well,
I'll
I'm
give you
not
the
quite,
option.
I'm not quite of that view. There is significant new material in there.
Okay,
But what I propose to do is rather than recall Mr. Pilgrove, because Mr. Sturgis is still giving his evidence next week, I propose to deal with them then. So
good, good.
That's my
That's
my
very
suggested approach.
cooperative on both your parts. Thank you.
Very grateful. So Mr. Pilgrove, to cut a long story short, I'm not going to be asking you any questions about any of that material because I haven't had an opportunity to consider it with my witness. So what I will try and do in that part 2 of my cross-examination is ask you the questions that I had prepared and the information that I had available at the time. And then, of course, Mr. Sturgis will pick up any issues arising from your additional material next week. Very good. Okay, so let's start then with the part 1 of my cross-examination to do with what was considered at the time and why refurbishment was rejected. And so I think the best place to start with that is to take up the DAS, which is CD 1.7a, page 55, section 1.10. Can I just check, have you got all of these documents electronically?
I do.
Great.
I'll be my Achilles heel. I'm doing my best.
But it sounds like both you and I and also the inspector are all dealing with electronic versions.
Page reference of 55.
The page reference is 55, yes. What I haven't checked is whether that is consistent with the electronic page numbering.
I'll just check.
I have the limitations of the existing building.
I think it is. I think it is the same electronic page numbering, so that's very helpful indeed.
Yeah, yeah.
So page 55, site and context limitations of the existing building.
Perfect. Yes, I have that.
And you start by summarising what, well, I say you, whoever wrote the DAS. It was you. Good. That's helpful to know. It starts by summarising the what you perceive to be the limitations of the existing buildings. And then in the penultimate paragraph of this page, final sentence, you say this increasingly negative and challenging context means a light touch or do nothing case is simply not an option. And that is a position which say endorses.
Right. Yeah.
Reference is then made in the next paragraph to the need for M&S to secure their future as a dominant retailer in a brand enhancing store. And then turning over the page to page 56, we then see the second of those plans, the refurbishment option with the additional storage. And we'll come back to that when we look at part 2 of the cross-examination at the Sturgis scheme, if I may call it that.
Yes. Yeah.
So with all of that in mind, we then get on page 57, at the beginning of page 57, at an early stage, the design team, which I'm assuming included yourself,
You did, yeah.
investigated the potential for refurbishment across the 3 existing buildings on site and assessed whether a new build development is justified and would outweigh the loss of the existing buildings on the site.
Yeah.
And you then set out what these studies concluded. Just so that we understand the chronology of it, when you talk about at an early stage, are we talking 2018?
We are.
This is when these feasibility studies were being undertaken. Okay, and you set out what the studies have concluded. There are 9 points there. I wonder if we can just quickly go through them just so that we're all understanding what the conclusions of those studies were. The first 4 points, and I'll give you a chance to just get up to speed. The first 4 points, to my mind, are all about heritage. They're all about whether there was in your eyes at least, a need to retain the building on heritage grounds. And that will, of course, be discussed with Dr. Neely later on today and tomorrow. Points 5 and 6 are all about this debate about the extent to which there could be a retrofit scheme that achieved a sufficient quality retail offer, or whether it needed to be a new build. So
Yeah.
I'll call these the
Yeah.
retail quality reasons. if you
Yes.
like. And then we see point 7, you present effectively that the heritage and visual quality case for the new build. And point 8 is a reference to the light touch refurbishment scenario, and how you say it leads to the new build proposing having a smaller total carbon footprint after C 15 years post completion in comparison to a light touch refurb. And I think the subsequent documents that you have presented suggest it's more like 17 years.
Correct,
Of
yes.
course, we'll come
Yeah.
back to that probably with
Yeah.
Ms. Allwood rather than you. Then at point 9, we get consideration of the facade retention option, in which you conclude effectively de minimis embodied carbon savings, just
Yeah.
as the sheer extent of the work that's being undertaken. So just pausing there, can I ask you to take up another document, please? And that's CD 4.13, the GLA's consideration. Stage 2 assessment.
Could you give me the number again, please?
CD 4.13.
That's the supplementary stage 2.
That's right, the stage 2 addendum to the stage 2 report.
Thanks.
Sure.
The stage 2 report is actually 412.
Yes.
Yeah,
Forgive me.
I have it. Yeah, great.
Thank you.
And where in the letter?
Paragraph 3 and 4. And here, Mr. Pilbro, we have at paragraph 3, the GLA's understanding of what had been considered, what had been explored by the applicant. The first being a heavy refurb with retained facades at Orchard House was one option, and then not considered feasible essentially for the reasons that you outlined in the DAS. And then for paragraph 4, as an alternative to extensive demolition, a lighter touch refurbishment was also considered. And then it goes on to effectively repeat what the applicant has suggested. So what we see there is confirmation, I would suggest, that in terms of the feasibility studies that were undertaken by the applicant back in 2018, you only looked at a facade retention scheme or a light touch scheme. You didn't look, I would suggest, at a comprehensive refurbishment scheme of the kind that is now being suggested by Mr. Sturgis. Is that fair?
No, if you go to the DAS, there are 16 schemes summarized. Actually, we did more than that. There were 16 schemes summarized. I guess with the benefit of hindsight, we focused our discussion recently today on new build versus refurbishment. But as I hope to outline in my evidence in chief, we were considering a wide range of other issues. Did you do the whole site comprehensively or separate the house? Was the balancing use, and clearly there was a balancing use to retail versus residential, hotel or office. Was the new development, if it was new development, did it in one building or two? Was it phased development? Did M&S stay on site or do they move off site? And I outlined, I think, in the evidence, one example of a quote heavy refurb that we considered. When we summarised in detail the schemes, we did look at light refurbishment in more detail with residents from the GLA, and we did look at a facade retention. But there were other schemes that were considered in the earlier stage and were not deemed viable or appropriate to meet the needs of the site or M&S's needs.
Very good, but we'll come on to that part of the DAS because I do know that there are
Right.
sections, so
Yeah.
we'll come on to that if I may. But just returning to where we were looking on page 57, there is then after you've got your 9 conclusions of the study,
Yes.
there is then a paragraph that says the design team also found there were considerable technical limitations in addition to the qualitative limitations. Most critically, there are limitations to acceptable increases in loading on the existing structure from foundations to current codes. So in relation to that, can I ask you to take up CD 1.32, which is the structural methodology statement? Page 6. And this time it's internal page 6 rather than electronic page 6. It's electronic page 10.
Electronic page 10, thank you.
And it's the section existing structures with the development site 2.3.
I have it printed page 6, electronic page 10, yeah.
Correct. And 2.3.1, this is the section of the structural methodology statement that's looking at the existing structures within the site.
Yeah.
2.3.1 is Orchard House. Third paragraph, we see Mellis LLP confirmed that the typical floors are being designed for an unfactored superimposed dead load of 5.6 km meters squared. I'm not an engineer, so
Okay, that makes sense to me.
yeah, I'm sure it does.
Kilonewtons per meter square
Thank you very much, sir.
per loading.
So that's 5.6 then for Orchard House. We then get at 1.3, 2.3.2 over the page, Orchard Street extensions, fourth paragraph down. This time Mellis LLP confirmed that the typical floors of both buildings are designed for a superimposed dead load of 5 kilonewtons per meter squared. And then lastly, Neil House, which is dealt with at 2.3.3. If we go over the page, we see the second,
Yeah,
the first complete paragraph, the live load allowance in the design is believed to be 7.5 kilonewtons per meter squared. We don't, so just taking all of that there and going back to what you said in the DAS, and it might be us, but it would be useful to understand so that I can then deal with this with Mr. Sturgis, what you say the limitations to acceptable increases in loading are, because we think that they're all in excess of the minimum requirements in the current codes.
and you would be correct. And let me take you back, if I may, to page 57. And there's a diagram at the bottom of 57, an arrow diagram is sort of orange and green squares. So I'm on CD, I think it's 1.7, the
Yes.
the DAS.
Yes.
So let me explain what the diagram is showing. So what Eric's looking at here is the loadings you characterize, the 5.7 and 7.5, are what I would describe as retail loadings, the very high floor loadings. And actually for modern office use, you need less than that. I mean, often 2.5 plus 1, 2.5 light loadings, 1 the partition. So say 3.5, rather than 5.7 and 7.5. That's good news because it means you can liberate some of the existing structural capacity to build more floors. How many more floors? Well, you see more on Neil House, where Eric suggests that we can construct 3 floors. And you'll notice that the little letters R on one side and O on the other side is retail or office. So they're saying, yeah, you can add additional floors if you convert retail to office. You convert 3.5, sorry, the 5.7 down to say 3.5. And that gives you capacity. And it's more capacity on Neil House. So 3 floors, on Orchard House, 2 floors. And I think that is back to back with the lower live loading capacity of Orchard House, so 5.7 rather than 7.5. So you can't build as much, but you can add 3 floors to Neil House and 2 floors to Orchard House. Where I think there's been some confusion is on Orchard Street. So their diagram illustrates an additional story on Orchard Street. And I think we illustrated that as an additional story on 23 Orchard Street. I think it would have been better interpreted by ourselves as an additional story on 10 Portland Mews. It's essentially the building to the rear, sir, and that can be extended by a story. And I think Mr. Sturgis suggested its extension, and I concur with that. I think it is possible to extend it by a story. Does that answer your?
That's helpful, yes. I mean, I'll if Mr. Sturgis wants to come back on any of that in his evidence next week, I'm sure we'll do so. So good. Okay, so that is what is said in that part of the DAS, and then as you very fairly observe, actually before we get to that, this section, there is a few other bits in this bit of your DAS that I want to take you to.
Sure.
We have on the next page, page 58, we've got the plans which show the misalignment between the facade retention and the new build.
Yes.
And again, common ground between you and Mr. Sturgis, we see it paragraph 3.9.7.3 of his rebuttal, that it's not a sensible option. Really not a sensible option, I think is what he said.
Right. No.
So that's, we can put that one in the bin. Page 59, we then get this. The investigation into refurbishment was undertaken. We see in your first sentence at the beginning of page 59, as noted on the previous spread, the design team investigated both the potential for whole site refurbishment. We know that in parentheses, light touch refurbishment, referencing back to page 57. That's the
Sorry,
one.
we're on page 59 now.
Yes,
Whereabouts?
first sentence, sir.
Thank you.
As noted on the previous thread, the design team investigated both the potential for whole site refurbishment and the retention of the Orchard House facade. Those two options, referencing back to paragraphs 8 and 9 on page 57, are the light touch refurbishment and the facade retention option, yes?
I mentioned we looked at a wide range of options, but set out in the DAS, those are the two options that were described,
Yeah.
yes.
Thank you. We then get the second sentence. The merits of this were assessed first and foremost through a heritage appraisal of the existing building fabric. And then there's some discussion of the heritage qualities of the existing building, which I'll cover with Dr. Neely. And then secondly, in the third paragraph of page 59, the case for facade retention was assessed with regards to commercial product, the environments able to be achieved. And then we get on this in the second column, finally, so this is the second paragraph of the second column, finally, the case for facade refurbishment was considered with regards to operational and embodied carbon, and essentially still looking at the facade retention option, and identifying it to be to have various weaknesses from a carbon perspective. There's then reference to the BREEAM ratings, comparing refurbishment and new build, and then the summary at the end. Refurbishment proposals, both on a whole site and facade retention basis, were found to not deliver the holistic and transformational change required to achieve the project's objectives and the visions the district set out by the council and M&S. So that's that section. We then go to the other part of the DAS, which deals with consideration of alternatives, and that is in CD 1.7b. They're still within the DAS, CD 1.7b.
Do you have is that a page reference, or that's a document?
Yeah, that's
DAS
the document.
Split up.
And then once you've got the,
Okay.
once you've got that up, I'll
CD one.
use a page reference, which is page 100.
Yes, I'm on it. We have our 16 axos on the right of the spread that I'm looking at.
The 16 options, yeah, and you referenced these earlier in response to a question from me from moment ago. And these, we then get at the next page, page 101, some consideration of the feasibility studies, the 16 options that were looked at. And you say initial feasibility studies investigate a range of approaches to the site's redevelopment, including refurbishment, full building of the site facade reconstruction, comprehensive single block development, independent or piecemeal building development, comprehensive 2-block development, exclusion or standalone meal house development. So these are the options that you were referring to earlier, and also in your evidence in chief. And you say that they were measured against 3 core objectives. Firstly, if I might just summarize, creating a retail environment suitable to retain M&S. Secondly, creating a supporting use on the site. And then thirdly, transformational change to the district. And then you say the most effective approach in meeting these objectives is a comprehensive single block development. And then you go on to explain the advantages of such a scheme. The 3 core objectives, which are also found in your proof at 4.1.8, Mr. Sturgis has noted in his rebuttal, paragraph 3.1.3, they don't include what I might call sustainability objectives, minimizing carbon impacts arising from the development. It wasn't a core objective for you. Consider, for example, circular economy, whole life carbon assessment and stuff at that time.
4.1.8, do I not reference which delivered appropriate caliber of employment space that met the highest standards of sustainability and well-being? Certainly sustainability was a core part of the brief we had from M&S, who pushed for the highest standards, BREEAM outstanding on the office space, BREEAM excellent on the retail space. I think it's fairly clear from the work I've presented, we are both expert in sustainability and concerned about environmental sustainability in all our work. I hope I'm answering your question if I say that I do believe a strong aspect of sustainability is to optimize the use of the site, and that definitely guided our consideration of refurbishment versus new build proposals. So I think I don't accept that sustainability wasn't a consideration for us. I do accept that in the wording of that page on the DAS, it's not explicitly referenced.
Thank
Phil
you.
Bray, you mentioned again the brief, and I raised this yesterday. Do we have a copy of that yet?
Provided.
Well, insofar as it exists in a single document.
Yeah.
So I've taken a note away that in particular you were keen to understand the potential and or the certainty of Marks and Spencer occupying the premises.
Indeed, yeah.
And whether there was any interaction between the architect team and M&S team about the nature of that. That's what we're focusing on at the minute in collecting the documents.
Okay, I thought I mentioned the brief as well, but in terms of contemporaneous documents.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
A spatial brief that defines not only the floor areas required, but also parameters of height. I think.
Well, I mean, the things that have been raised so far is, did M&S give you free rein to look at every option? And if there's a contemporary document that sets that out,
Yeah.
that would be useful.
The requirements to look at every option.
Right. Well,
Yeah.
you know, if you've got that document dated from 2018, it strikes me as useful
Yeah.
to see it.
We have certainly, it's referred to in Miss.
I mean, redact any financial information, obviously.
But anyway, we'll do that.
Well, thank you very much.
Sorry.
So, Mr. Pilbrow, I take your point. That there is a reference to sustainability, but 4.1.8 of your proof, second bullet, you're there talking about the sustainability of the employment space that you want to deliver. So would it be fair to say that it's the sustainability of the operational sustainability of the new build that's being a core objective there, not the, if you like, the sustainability of the overarching decision about whether to proceed with refurbishment or rebuild. That's very fair, thank you. DAS that we see and take as the applicant's evidence doesn't actually explain the assessment of the feasibility options, the 16 feasibility options, and how they were scored, if you like, against the core objectives. We just get the statement that the comprehensive single block development was selected and reasons why. We don't see any of that information in the DAS.
The buildings haven't changed from the buildings we were looking at in 2018, and I think in most of my proof and as the evidence this morning, hopefully I set out some of the constraints that those buildings imposed on any refurbishment, imposed whether it was a light touch or a deep cut and carve refurbishment. They were certainly present when we assessed this with M&S. They were certainly present when we discussed the scheme with Westminster.
Okay, so let me rephrase my question, because that's obviously relevant to part 2 of what I want to ask you about. Part 1, what was done at the time? Was there a scoring exercise that was undertaken? How did you actually do this exercise of considering the different options?
Viewed with M&S as our client on regular sessions over the course of 2018. We looked at options and then we refined options that met their needs and the needs of the site. So it was a process of selection and refinement. I think we started with 16 schemes and reduced it down to those options that met their brief.
Okay, and the options that were reduced down, that was the light touch refurb and the facade retention. In terms of
I need to check the detail. No, I think it was to look at new build options.
right, that was new build at that point. Okay. The DAS, there's then a page of the DAS which includes some initial design strategies for an initial pre-application meeting in April 2019, and these are for a new build scheme.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then the next page of the DAS, we get the first pre-application proposals, April 2019. There, I think it's being proposed a ground plus 19-story residential tower, which unsurprisingly hasn't made it into the final scheme. But a couple of times in your evidence in chief, you said that at the time of considering refurbishment feasibility studies, there was engagement with the council. I can't see anything about that in the DAS. That came as news to me, because I can see clearly that once it became the decision of M&S and yourselves to proceed with a new build, there was then clearly significant engagement with the council.
Yeah.
But what I'm unclear on is what happened before that first pre-application meeting in April 2019. There's nothing in the DAS which refers to the fact that any of these refurbishment options were considered with the council.
We started with a very detailed site due diligence. We looked at the existing buildings, their history, heritage, significance, construction structure, and we assessed whether it met M&S's needs or indeed the needs of the site. And we concluded, M&S and ourselves concluded that it did. We shared that thinking with Westminster in the early pre-app meetings. We went through in great detail the constraints of the existing building. We didn't say to Westminster, hey, we could do a refurbishment scheme or a new build, what do you think? We said our conclusion is that the refurbishment is not, doesn't meet our own requirements or the wider requirements of the site. So that was the content of those early pre-application meetings, and we got support for that direction of travel.
So the decision to proceed with new build by yourselves and M&S was undertaken prior to any meeting engagement with the council?
Yes, we made we came to the view that that was necessary to deliver both their brief and the wider needs of the site. In our early meetings with Westminster, we rehearsed our thinking and they endorsed it.
And they never asked you to reconsider the refurbishment?
No, because we went through in great detail and with care the constraints of the 3 existing buildings. And as I've tried to outline this morning, we're a world away from delivering an acceptable solution, either for M&S or indeed for the wider use of the site.
Can we take up Mr. Sturgis's rebuttal, Crew? paragraph 3.1.4.
That I don't have on my system, but I don't know if you could kindly read me the section. I'm familiar with the proof, so.
So we're going to be looking at it quite a lot. Okay. So it's probably best that you do get hold of a copy.
It is now a core document, so if you've got the list of core documents, you'll find it on there.
That's very kindly helped me out. Thank you.
3.1.4 says that the way Mr. Sturgis has structured his rebuttal is that extracts from your evidence are in black italics.
Yeah.
And then there are comments from Mr. Sturgis in red underline.
CD 917, sir.
Thank you.
CD 917, paragraph 3.14. And here, Mr. Sturgis is looking at your 16 options. And he says none of these cover the option of retained structure and facade with all new cores and services and internal reconfiguration. The option second from the right in the bottom row describes full site facade retention is not this. It's an option to retain the facades and build entirely new structures behind. He says there is no reason why such an option is not being explored. And I didn't hear anything in your evidence in chief to countermand that. Is it correct of Mr. Sturgis to say that a scheme of the kind that he has put forward was not considered back in your feasibility study in 2018?
I don't think it is correct. Again, if I can draw your attention to the 16, if we look to the right, refurbishment with vertical extensions. I agree that the AXO doesn't tell us whether we're moving the cores or not. That's fine. I think actually I showed this morning the plans that went with that option. So that does show you a refurbishment of the facade retention with vertical extensions. You'll notice, however, that on the AXO, we were extending the 10 Portman News building further than Arab's later qualified we could. So that predated the Arab structural constraints. I mean, again, I think not unhelpfully, Simon's suggestions about the core removal illustrates a cut and carve approach. It's not dissimilar from what we looked at ourselves in 2018, and it doesn't address the fundamental shortcomings of the three buildings.
The final option, the 16th option that you just referred to, was this a light touch refurbishment scheme with additional floors on top, vertical extensions, or was it a deep retrofit of the kind that Mr. Sturgis is referring to?
It's a deep retrofit. If you do the vertical extensions, it's not a light touch. Essentially, you're having to, you're bringing new structure to optimize the amount of accommodation. So I would put that in the cut and carve range. The plans which I showed this morning proposed a new core on Orchard Street serving offices on the upper levels, and we removed some, but not all, of the perimeter cores. And in our options, we don't think we ever went as far as taking all the cores out. And that for the reason that it would be very high carbon, stone expensive, but it's a perfectly valid option to say that you could explore it. What you can't say is it wouldn't be viable, or you can't say it would deliver good quality product.
So you didn't look at a core reconfiguration option, but your evidence to the inquiry is that you did look at a deep retrofit of the kind that Mr. Sturgis suggested. But that's, of course, we're going to need to take your word for that, because there's nothing in any of the documentation to show that that was something that you did.
Well, we're after that, and if necessary, we'll recall witness when we get here.
Thank you, sir. To the extent that there has been further consideration of retrofit options in the framework of these proceedings, because of course you've had to respond to the case that's being advanced by SAVE, that has all been done in the context of having already made the decision to proceed with a new build. And so inevitably, it must be right that there's a degree of defensiveness on your part, because the decision has been taken to proceed with a new build. You're then being told, come on a second, and you're then having to react to the criticisms that are being made. Is that fair?
I don't think it is. I think if you read policy carefully, Russell outlined this view in his opening remarks. policy certainly has evolved since 2018. I would absolutely agree with you.
Yeah.
But I don't see any piece of policy that says you shouldn't be optimizing the use of the site, and there's no requirement to pursue refurbishment where it's not viable or appropriate best use of the site. Policy is advanced in consideration of embodied carbon. I think that's an important thing to say. And we have now at our disposal as architects very sophisticated tools to evaluate embodied carbon, but it doesn't tell us that a scheme that manifestly fails to meet the requirements of the site, let alone the requirements of M&S, suddenly becomes sensible where it was not sensible in 2018, and that's clear for me.
Okay, so that's the way you frame your evidence. So there's obviously going to be some policy discussion, but I'm going to leave that for other witnesses.
I'm relieved.
Just for clarity, I'm very happy for you to explore with witnesses what they understand the policy to mean, but not what it actually does mean, because that's a matter for submissions and ultimately the courts.
Thank you, sir. That's very helpful. Well, I'm not going to ask Mr. Pilbrow even that far.
No, because that's what you forgot.
That's what Mr. Goddard, but I'm grateful for that indication, sir. So perhaps we can agree at least this. You made the decision in presumably the end of 2018 to proceed with a new build. That was the decision. M&S made that decision on the basis of your advice. And that decision has not been revisited since then.
Correct. Yes.
Okay. That's everything I wanted to ask you in relation to part one. So if we now look at your proof and your consideration of refurbishment set out in section 4. And the best thing to do probably is to have that open.
Yeah.
As well as having Mr. Sturgis's rebuttal.
Yeah, great.
And in Mr. Sturgis's rebuttal, it really gets going in section 3.2.
Yeah.
Where he starts sequentially going through the various issues.
Yeah.
So his approach, he doesn't structure things in the same way as your
Yeah.
section 4 does.
Yeah.
He's tried to group the concerns or the obstacles that you've identified to refurbishment and then responded to them collectively. So the first of those is about column grids and floor to ceiling heights. And I should say that for all of this part of my cross-examination,
Yeah.
there's necessarily going to need to be a degree of updating once Mr. Sturgis has had an opportunity to look at your new material. So starting with issue 3.2, this is the column grids and the floor to ceiling heights. Perhaps we can agree a few things. Can we agree, firstly, that Mr. Sturgis is right, that if you need ceilings in the first place, I know that sounds like a strange thing to say, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
If you need ceilings in the first place, services can be rationalised into a much smaller zone, enabling the heights to be raised. Do you agree with what he said?
Yeah, I wouldn't assume that we would install a ceiling and retrofit, and I think the inspector saw with Alex and I the fit out of the Kensington building, and there we have what are termed rafts. So you have zones of ceiling and zones where you expose the greater height.
Yeah.
My advice from Arabs was that we take Orchard House, a downstairs steel structure. I think the top flange of the steels are buried in the hollow plot slab, and it would be difficult to make large penetrations in that steelwork. So the air distribution would be below the soffit of below the bottom of those beams, and we would typically allow 450 millimeters for that zone of air and other high-level surfaces. I completely accept you wouldn't necessarily put a ceiling in, but you would have those elements that would intrude below the beams. Contrast that with a modern office building. A steel structure would have penetrations detailed into the beams. You'd run the air through the beams, and you get the additional 450 of height.
Okay, so there's agreement, it seems, between you and Mr. Sturgis that the existing structure, you can see on page 8 of Mr. Sturgis's brief, it's got the plan there. There are these quite significant existing gaps between the structure and the ceiling that are currently being used for services, but they could be rationalised and reduced, thereby giving capacity for increased floor height.
Try and answer that in a different way. I think Simon and I would agree that, 3.8, 3.7, they're very respectable sort of floor heights for a modern office building, and that's what we have in Orchard House. The difference that I would point out is that a modern office building, a steel frame, you would have the air running through the strata. It would be designed that way. Here, we don't have that. We have the solid steel beams, and the air needs to be below them. And that's why we're allowing that 450mm zone. We do agree that a ceiling is not, mandatory. You might not do a ceiling, and where you have the air ducts, you have that lower constraint height, and then you will see the voids above that. I hope that's kind of clear. I didn't.
That's clear to me, and Mr. Sturgis, as you know, is sitting directly to my left, and so if it's not clear to him, I'm sure he'll say so next week. 3.2 and 3.3 of Mr. Sturgis's rebuttal, he talks about the BCO guides, and there's nothing in there that you disagree with, is there?
No.
About the ability to achieve compliance. And the graph that you included in your evidence in chief, I'm sorry, I don't know what slide it was, but there was a graph, I think, where you depicted the floor heights of the existing building with a number of other M&S stores.
Yes.
And then the floor height of the proposed.
Yeah.
And it would be interesting, wouldn't it, to see where in that graph of the Sturgis deep retrofit height and floor would be. I mean, I'm not suggesting that you do that, but it's going to be on a par with other existing M&S stores, isn't it?
So firstly, just to be clear, the graph I showed dealt with retail floors, and we reported the retail clear height. On the office floor, let's say level 3 on Orchard House, below the 450, if you take 450 below the steel, you have 2.44 to that side. So the underside of my air ducts or my lighting is at 2.44 meters on level 3. That compares to 2.95 in the building that we're proposing. It's always difficult when you do the numbers in the minima, and the PCO references are useful and valid here. But I would caution that one thing that we believe designing offices as we do, tenants want deep plan, flexible spaces, and we saw a good example when we toured the Kensington building yesterday. It's 26 meters quarter wall. On the proposals were 22 meters. And it's important that the height is proportional to the depth of the floor plate. So if you have a very shallow floor office, fine with 2.44. But on a deep plan, as we propose on this site, a deep plan that's market facing, it's what tenants want, you need to be in proportion, and therefore you need the sort of heights that we're delivering.
Okay, so perhaps we can frame the point in this way. The raising of floor heights in a retrofit scheme could bring this building in line with other M&S stores, but it won't achieve the deep and flexible spaces that you envision for the new scheme. Is that roughly where we are?
Yeah, because again, not to confuse us, the benchmarking of height, which comes from M&S's own data, I think it's attached to the appendix proof of Chris Goddard, reports the heights of M&S retail stores. I think I have a selection of 10 of them, and I gave you the bar chart on that, and it shows that the existing is substantially lower than any of the comparables that they've recently refurbished.
Yes.
I think the discussion we're currently having together is the adaptability of the upper floors for office use. And I was, to be very clear about my position, it's not that it couldn't technically be done, but I think the quality of that space would be quite poor, because the quarter wall dimension, and Simon and I agree about the optimum quarter wall dimension, but also the core where I'm drawing it.
Yeah.
I think that at 22 meters would feel very low, very poor, very constrained. And technically, physically, you could do that, but I think the caliber of space would be poor. And if I can for you to hear McCarthy's advice, like Frank's view, is that there's a flight to quality going on in office space and people need the highest quality of environment. That I don't believe will be delivered by the refurbishment. I know we're focusing on height and you're going to take me to columns, but on the height point, I
Yeah.
think there is an element of compromise.
Okay, so it's an element of compromise. It wouldn't be possible, you say, to achieve what you could achieve with a new building with a retrofit. There's an element of compromise. Okay. Do you say that what could be achieved in terms of floor heights, and I'm talking about the retail, is unacceptable, or some way not going to be sufficiently attractive to achieve that flight to quality?
In retail, unacceptable, yes.
Just trying to understand.
No.
parameters,
It's what
'cause
we
these-
said. So I'm making just again to clarify that. I think we've seen in the commercial office market, a flight to quality. And then in retail, we've seen, perhaps you do characterize it as a flight to quality, but I wasn't using that phraseology. We've seen the increasing importance of the high environmental quality for customers. And that is delivered in the new M&S stores that they reference. And it's critical to their success. I don't think that's deliverable in the context of the existing store. The height is one factor, there are others, but the height is insufficient to deliver that quality of space.
Okay, so that's your position. We know what Mr. Surges says. We'll hear more from him next week. The column grids then.
Yes.
You have said in your rebuttal proof, we'll just get that up, your rebuttal proof with paragraph 4.11. A. The quality of
Mel's coming to my aid again. Thank you.
4.11A,
I guess we've got the tunnels here.
page 15.
Thank you. Good. I'm there, yes, thank you.
And you say that the quality of internal accommodation would be fatally compromised by the dense and irregular column grids. And you then say that the few sentences down, do you see the sentence, the tighter grid constrains efficiency, layout and visual permeability to a terminal degree. So fatal and terminal.
Yeah.
Not, I mean, you know, of course, that Mr. Sturgis disagrees with that. Would it be fair to say that you're perhaps getting a little bit carried away there? There is nothing quite so severe about the column grid. I mean, the way Mr. Sturgis puts it is that it's not ideal, but it's also not an insurmountable problem. And he's set out his plans on page 11 of his rebuttal, where he says, this is how you can deal with it. This is how you can resolve this obstacle. Do you still say on the basis of his evidence
Well, I think
that it's fatally compromised?
Yeah, if I can take you to 4.4 of my proof of evidence, that's page 55.
Mm.
I've exerted two sections of the floor plate, pretty prominent sections when you first come into Orchard House on the ground floor. That's the middle drawing, and the columns continue up as we saw in our site visit yesterday. Column spacings between columns 2.71, 2.45, and 1.5 meters. I mean, what can you do in that space? And the answer is you do what M&S says. It's like basically there's nothing there. There's no trading going on there. You just leave gaps for columns. If they were selling columns, they'd be in good shape. But you know, it effectively sterilizes a section of that floor. And I think all of the column grids are quite tight, and you feel it very strongly when you're in the building. The mist alignment of the different buildings amplifies that density of grid. You might say that's a qualitative point more important to the retail than to the office. But I think neither retail nor office could use this section of the floor plate.
Okay. So that's it. Okay, so I think that this is a useful exercise because it's making me understand that the parameters of where we are now
Yeah.
in terms of
Yeah.
Mr. Sturgis's evidence, your evidence. We've
Yeah.
heard your
Yeah.
evidence, we've heard Mr.
Yeah.
Sturgis's evidence, especially updated in light of the material that you presented this morning.
Yeah.
On the, I'm just making sure that I've covered all the points I needed to. Just lastly on the column.
Yeah.
Column grids. The way Mr. Sturgis has characterised it in his rebuttal, if we just look at 3.2.11.2, is that actually, after all is said and done, the existing column grid is not dissimilar to the new build column grid, although there are some additional columns he accepts. And he says that with careful examination, it may be possible to remove some of these duplicated structures and potentially also reduce the casings around some or all of the columns. And even if not, the existing floor plates would be a lot cleaner, simpler, and more usable. And the net to gross floor area ratio would be significantly improved. And he's being realistic, isn't he, at 3.2.11.3. He's not saying this is going to be as neatly arranged as you could do with a new build. But
Look,
significantly better than the existing building, these things can be achieved.
I was puzzled there because if you count the number of columns, you've got about twice as many in the refurbishment. And I think just to go to some hard numbers on this, we're saying the typical bay size in Orchard House is 53 square meters, and the proposed grid of the new building is a mixture of 94.5 and 81 square meters. Well, can I do an approximation? Should we say average 86? Place 53. So that gives you an insight in the difference in column densities. It's like 50% more dense. 1, 2, they don't align with each other. And 3, we have columns that, like Solomon, I could be pushing at both columns at once because they're that close together. So it's not really sustainable to say that they're the same thing. I'm sorry, I don't agree.
Okay, differences in the levels between the buildings.
Yeah.
We've had a look at this already.
Yeah.
3.2.12.1 of Mr. Sturgis's rebuttal, he deals with this, and he thinks that you have overstated.
Mhm.
If I may summarise what he said. You've overstated the problems arising from the different levels. In practice, according to Mr. Sturgis, it's only at the second floor level between Orchard House and the Orchard House extension that this is currently an issue. Otherwise, the accessible floors all line through, which is a major benefit, enabling a sensible rebate.
This is happily a question of fact, so we're not going to bore that over there. So the floors do align at level 1. I think that's common ground between Simon and I. They do not align between Orchard House and the Orchard House extension at level 2, nor do they align at level 3 or 4 or 5. I mentioned it this morning. They don't align on the ground floor either, but you can't see that because the candy stores are different from the M&S. But if you wanted to connect them together, as I think in a refurbishment you would find a misalignment between Neil House and Orchard House. And I mentioned in passing that the Orchard House existing ground floor level does not permit disabled access on the corner of the site. So we're certainly agreeing that level 1 aligns. And it, again, to be very clear, it doesn't align at level 2 north-south, but it does align at level 2 east-west. So, and that's true up the building. So I hope that's a kind of question that we all agree on.
So, okay. Is this another situation where you think that a deep retrofit could resolve this issue, but with an element of compromise? Use your language earlier.
I think it's quite serious compromise, because again, one of the things that we're more concerned by is accessibility and equality. And if you take, for example, the level 2, where the floors don't align front back, you have to solve that with ramps. But every connection back into the office core needs to have disabled access. You can't provide ambulance access to one connection to the core and not into another. So in practice, you end up with ramps at every point of connection, and the ramps, well, you saw, the inspector saw yesterday when you're on level 2, the size of the ramps that are required. it's a negative for efficiency, it's a negative for accessibility. I'm happy to use the word compromise, but I think it's a serious one.
That's fair. Okay, so this is probably an appropriate moment. I've got a number of other issues I need to cover with
Okay.
Mr. Sturgis, but I'm noting the time.
Lovely. Okay, well, we'll adjourn in a moment. Mr. Bilbao, if you're not familiar with the rules, you're not allowed to talk to any of your team during the lunch break. But if you do want someone to get you a sandwich and a cup of tea, then of course that's perfectly.
That's very good, thank you.
Right, so until 2:05, the inquiry is adjourned.
Chris.
Yep.
Have I got the images?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, no, yeah, you should bring the. Change our names.
I do have I'm not now. Yeah.
I got it from.
What about?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're live now.